faculty advisor for Sui Generis this year. I'm really excited about that. So for my lecture, I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of groups of writers. And so if I could just do a show of hands, I'm going to talk first about the Beat Generation. Have many of you heard of the Beat Generation? Rings a bell? All right. And then I know some of you have heard of this other writer because I've seen some students with his book under students' arms around campus, the Savage Detectives, Roberto Bolaño. Does that ring a bell for some folks? Okay. So for the Beat Generation, just to kind of orient you a little bit and give you a feel for who they were, these are three of the primary figures associated with the movement. On the left, Jack Kerouac. Does anybody know a Jack Kerouac book? Shout it out. On the Road, for example, the Dharma Bums. In the middle is a youngish Allen Ginsberg. And anybody know the famous poem Allen Ginsberg? Oh, I saw that as mine, so my generation, so on and so forth. On the right, William Burroughs. Yes! Got some excitement about Burroughs, and he wrote Naked Lunch, among many other things. And so, as many of you know, mid-20th century U.S. writers with a bit of a rebellious streak, at least insofar as the content of their writing, not always in the form. And so, the other writer that I'm going to talk about is related in some ways, but is temporally and geographically quite different. Bolaño is also a figure who's associated with a group. And so, I'm going to talk about that group a little bit today as well in my work as a translator. I'm going to be talking a lot about my own work, but I'm not talking about me. I want to be talking about the ideas behind translation, motivations to translate. And so it feels a little bit strange to be talking about myself, but I want to talk briefly about how I got into translation and the practice of translation. As I look around the room and feel such powerful energy and such youth, I thought back to when I was young. And I fell in love with literature. I've heard a few of these stories from some of you in some of the workshops we've done. When I was a teenager, I had a fabulous English teacher with whom I'm still in contact to this day. Alex McLean was his name. And I remember he taught us in one class when I was all 13, 14 years old, the work of this fellow, Pablo Neruda, who you've taken a Spanish class you might have bumped into, or if you grew up in a Spanish-speaking country, you certainly encountered at some point. And anybody heard of Neruda? Is this a new name for some folks? He has a certain style that I found really attractive as a young person. So he wrote poems like the 20th of the 20 love poems, from the 20 love poems in the Song of Despair that he wrote when he was about 19, as a matter of fact. And the 20th poem begins, puedo escribir los versos más tristes esta noche, escribir, por ejemplo, que la noche está estrellada y gritan azules los astros a lo lejos. I can write the saddest verses tonight, right? For example, the sky is starry and the stars are blinking blue off in the distance. And that got me excited as a young person. But when I had the good fortune to move to Chile and study for a while, I started to discover all sorts of poets that were very different. Neruda sort of performs a certain kind of regionality, I might say. He's received in a certain way in the United States. That's the kind of poetry I was exposed to as a young teenager. But as I got older, I started to find other poets that were very different tonally, very different stylistically. And this was in the 90s. The internet was a thing, but it's not the thing you think about by any stretch of the imagination. Email wasn't terribly common. A phone call home was about $5 a minute. So what do you suppose I did to stay in touch? Letters, old school. I wrote letters by hand, and I would discover these poets. I was a high school student, but I inserted myself in creative writing workshops at the local college, and I started to read all these fascinating poets like Jorge Teguera, whose image I'm going to put up there. Teguera was also from southern Chile, as was Neruda, but wasn't terribly well known regionally, and definitely not translated into English. So I said, well, I'm going to give this a whirl. And in my letters home, I would translate things like Teguera's poetry. So for me, as a young person finding my way into translation, the first gesture that I thought of in terms of translation was simply to say, hey, check this out. This is pretty cool. I want to share this with you. So I would do that with my friends back home. And this is one of Teguera's more famous poems. I'll just put the beginning portion of it. Fin del mundo. Fin del mundo. We're going to do this all. We can send this off for publication if we keep it up. El día del fin del mundo será limpio, will be clean y ordenado organized, orderly. I'll take either one of those. Como el cuaderno del mejor alumno. Like the best student's notebook. So the day of the end of the world will be clean and orderly, like the best student in the course's notebook. Not like your L&T notebook. This notebook looks a little bit different. El borracho del pueblo. Everybody knows borracho, whether it's in Spanish or not. Borracho. Drunk. El borracho del pueblo dormirá en una zanja. Where do drunk people sleep in popular imagery? Ditches. Zanja in this case would be a ditch. The express train will pass through without stopping. En la estación? In the station. So what do we call it when a word has the same Latin root and kind of looks the same and sounds the same? Cognate, right? So far so good. This is a poem that kind of revels in its own transparency. It's conversational, it's direct. You can hear from the tone, it's quite different from, say, the Neruda style, which is often the received style of poetry from Latin America that's read and circulated in the United States. So I was really excited to find this. Another poet I was extremely excited to learn about when I started studying poetry in Chile was Enrique Lin. Enrique Lin is a poet who was most active in the 1960s. He died in the 1980s. And his most famous piece is La Pieza Oscura, right? And so if we do the same thing, we've got some cognates here, some that may or may not work. If you had to guess, pieza, piece, right? As in a piece of candy, one might think. And so how might we translate it as La Pieza Oscura? The obscure piece, right? And that would be one way to translate it. But once you start to get to know the language and some of the diatopical varieties in Spanish, where the language shifts a little bit, pieza in the southern cone, and particularly in Chile, doesn't refer to a piece. It refers to a room, as in a bedroom. So what you might call in Mexico, recámara, for example, is pieza in the southern cone, particularly in Chile. Oscura, we might, translate as dark. So the idea is that it's the dark room. That's actually how the great scholar and translator John Faulkner translated it in 1978. He did an edition for New Directions with that exact title. But if we step back and think about the obscure piece, I mean, that is one way to go about it. We're privileging something different about the text, right? We'd be privileging in some way, shape, or form the musicality, potentially, of the text, the way the text sounds. But if you stop and think about it, there might be some problems with that gesture. I'll point to one or two that occurred to me, and I'll point to a scholar who thinks about this profoundly. If we're reaching out from the north into the south and making a poem do essentially whatever we think sounds cool, there's a long history of extractivism within which that gesture could be situated. And the scholar of translation, Lawrence Venuti, goes so far as to say that kind of gesture, just taking a poem and making it sound and play around like however you think it might sound cool, without an actual understanding of the context from which it emerges, Venuti goes so far as to call that an act of cultural imperialism. So here I am sitting writing my letters home, and all these ideas about translation, I'm working with them, I'm struggling with them, and then I start reading a bunch of people who are a whole lot smarter than I am, like Lawrence Venuti. I would recommend the work of Friedrich Schleiermacher, the German scholar from the 18th century, if you're interested in translation. Walter Benjamin is a name you might have heard. He's the one we sort of stole for the title of our talk. He has a famous piece called The Task of the Translator. So as a young person started to think about translation, I went from, hey, check this out, to holy moly, there's some responsibilities and some ethical considerations about the words that you put on a page, especially considering one's positionality. And so bringing that thought process to bear, I'm going to jump ahead several years to my work that Bill alluded to on beat poetry. And so this is where the beat generation comes in that I asked you about before. And I put up on purpose a picture of sort of the three most well-known beat writers, Kerouac, Ginsberg, and Burroughs, and I full well that there are many others. And so I fell into a project, for lack of a better term, with a Mexican poet named Rubén Medina. And we developed a project that was an anthology of beat writers called Una tribu de salvajes improvisando las puertas del infierno, Antología Beat. I've since learned to do shorter titles. It's a bit of a mouthful, and I actually forgot the title one time I was being interviewed about this. But the anthology, besides that particular flaw, had some goals. And one of the goals is we're translating from English into Spanish, again, with the poet Rubén Medina. And as you can see from the cover, There's a lot more names than just those three poets or writers that I referred to earlier. We focused principally on the poetry of the Beat Generation. And one of our goals was to look at the Beat Generation as an American movement, and I say that in the continental sense. I'm not using that as a synonym for the United States. But as an American movement, it was quite frequently translated into Spanish from Spain, which isn't good, bad, or indifferent. It's the typical translation process would go through Spanish publishing houses, multinational presses in Spain that distributed the work in Latin America. And we found that a bit strange. So when there were options to choose between a variety of Spanish, say from Spain, or a variety of Spanish from Latin America, we opted always for the Latin American. And often it was published in Mexico, the Universidad Autónoma de Nuevo León. In Monterrey, we would often include Mexican terminology if we didn't think it would be an obstacle for a reader from another Latin American country. In addition to trying to think of the context out of which the beats came, the context in which they were received, we also wanted to expand the notion of the Beat Generation, so included a lot of women who, in Spanish translation, were not frequently paid much attention to. Joanne Kiger, for example, Anne Waldman, who's in your anthology that some of you may have read, I think today, if you're in David's section, you might have come across that. And we also wanted to include people of color who weren't frequently translated, such as Emery Baraka, Bob Kaufman. So we had this goal to sort of expand the vision of the Beat Generation, and in a way produced a critical reading of the group. We made some selections about the language, we made some selections about the poets, and we came up with this book. When you publish stuff, sometimes it gets reviewed. So you might have gotten some feedback from your LET essay, and you're wondering, oh gosh, what did the teacher write for scribbly notes in the margin of my LET essay? Your palms start to sweat, and you get nervous. The same thing happens when you publish things or you get reviewed in the real world, so to speak. And so there was a review by an intellectual I admired enormously, named Heriberto Gibbons, of this book after it came out. And he suggested, well, you're kind of decentralizing the figure of major beat poets, Kerouac, Ginsberg, Burroughs, and saying it's a bigger group. You're saying that they were engaged in some kind of experimental form of writing to a degree that may or may not hold true in terms of the form of their writing. And he ultimately kind of psychoanalyzed our book and said we weren't really writing about the beats, we were writing about the infrarrealistas. And Medina, the poet with whom I work, was actually a founding member of that group. So for a minute, my feelings were hurt. And then I said, wait a minute, maybe you're right. Maybe there are some ways we're talking about this group of Mexican poets who hasn't, and primarily Mexican poets, there's also poets from Chile and other countries as well, who haven't gotten the recognition perhaps they deserve. And that was when Ruben and I turned to this other group of poets and said, what can we do about this other group of poets that maybe we have something to say about based on the way people are reading this particular book of beat poetry? And we turned to the project of working on the poets who were associated with Roberto Bolaño. Has anybody read The Savage Detectives? No? I know some of you might have encountered it at some point. The Savage Detectives are based on a group of real poets. And so it's kind of interesting because Bolaño is a hugely, he's a bestseller, which is something that I never would have expected when I started reading him about 25 years ago. The Mandarin edition, for example, of The Savage Detectives sold out in a matter of days the first time it came out. This book has created what I would call a cottage industry of Bolaño studies at this point. So it's very, very famous academically, very, very famous commercially, and yet the poets that it portrays are paradoxically not so famous. So in the novel, he calls them the real visceralists. And it's a group of young, rebellious writers that he portrays in a very sort of romanticized way in some ways, but in a very realistic way in others. So, for example, the real-life poet, Mario Santiago Papasquiaro, he's portrayed in the novel as a character named Ulises Lima, who's one of the protagonists. Bolaño, as he would do in this novel and many other novels, portrayed himself as somebody named Arturo Belano. So he came up with similar names for folks, not so similar in some cases, but names that you were transparent enough and characterizations that were transparent enough that if you knew about these folks, you would know who the real poets are. There's a ton of studies about this that I can point you to if you're interested. But what I wanted to do, and again, working with Ruben, who was one of the founding members of the Infras, was to do some kind of project, some kind of an anthology to talk about this group. And the opportunity came up. Ruben and I co-edited an issue of the Chicago Review that was dedicated to the press. And I got to thinking about that criticism I got from the book that I worked on before about thinking about the relationship between authors and experimental writing, thinking about the ways writers think about writing. And so one of the decisions we made for this issue of the journal was to go forth with the manifestos. The group wrote a couple of manifestos. You know what a manifesto is? Can somebody shout out their own understanding of a manifesto? Statement of ideas, statement of intent, so kind of a programmatic statement of what they're all about and what they intend to do. And we'll look at one of those in just a minute. I thought it was important to put that out because this group thought a lot about the role of writing, thought a lot about their intellectual activity. And if they were kind of lumped together as a group of rebellious poets, as they often are in criticism in Latin America, that aspect of their project kind of got the short shrift. Two related issues that were very much present for me in thinking about what responsibility I had as a translator working on this project was the fact that for the most part I was dealing with living writers and also lesser known writers. And that just made me want to take extra care, knowing this is somebody who could potentially read this, somebody who could potentially come into contact with us with this translation of their work. And also the fact that if they're a lesser known writer, I want to make sure I don't make mistakes. You never want to make mistakes. But it would feel like I was punching down almost, like, oh, you don't really matter. I'm just going to do this really quickly and really clearly. I took extra care to go over every single line and make sure there wasn't a single mistake. So I was putting forward these translations, or at least to the best of my ability. I felt that extra pull to try to do that. And so to give you a couple of examples of the work of these writers, and I think I'll talk about one poet from the group before I turn the microphone over to Manu. I mentioned before, Mario Santiago Papasquiaro is probably the most famous poet in the group. And I want to give a huge shout out to my colleague, Cole Heinowitz, in the literature department here. She's a major translator of Mario Santiago and does some really interesting work on him. She's in the literature program and does a number of interesting courses also in Frankenstein. But she's an expert on this particular group of writers, and she teaches here as well. This is the manifesto. I'm not talking too much. That's what happens in lectures. What I think I'll do, I'm going to point up, at least for the first lines of the manifesto, and then point out. When I point out, just read the line that comes on the screen, okay? Tell it to you. That's what we do. Okay? Ready? Oh, wrong way. What do you propose? Do not make writing a profession. Woo, good. Okay, I think it's going to get really hairy if we keep doing that, so perfect. You did much better than I would in your position. I'll field this one. This would be hard to read as a group, so I'll just read it. To deal with insignificant things without institutional value. To play, art should be unlimited in quantity, accessible to all, and if possible, made by all. I don't know how to read that, but it's in the manifesto. And it seems to me it wouldn't be that far afield from something you might have written in your L&T notebooks at some point during the last 2 weeks, right? Huh? And so this youthful energy of these poets struck me as also very important to translate because I've been around for a while. I've been to a lot of conferences, readings, events about poetry, particularly in Mexico and Chile, and events that were related in some way to this group of writers who are no longer young, they're more in the 50s for the most part. There's sort of this attractiveness about poetry to young people that I hadn't seen in a while. So I also wanted to take extra care with this translation, maybe make a text that could appeal to somebody reading poetry for the first time, just like Neruda appealed to me so many years ago when I was a young person learning to fall in love with poetry. So I'll give you just a snippet. This is Mario Santiago. He was something. He would compose while walking, and he would write on any surface he could get his hands on. So if you lent him a book, Mario Santiago would write stuff in the margins. If he was at a bar, he'd grab a napkin, the next poem would happen on there, and he would walk and walk and walk and walk. He was a peripatetic writer. He would walk nonstop and write poems. And so this is one of the, I'll just give a brief snippet of any translation, one of the poems he would write while walking. Callejón sin salida, ayúdanos a ensanchar nuestros destinos. Tu tan inmuneado, cueva, desierto, metrópoli, filosa. He kind of got a rhythm going so many times it felt like he was almost freestyling in his writing because he had this actual physical movement that he was doing. And so I tried to convey some of that in the translation. In Callejón Sin Salida, I'll say in a moment why I wound up with Dead End. That was one of the first suggestions by Ruben and Medina, but then you could say Blind Alley, cul-de-sac, there's multiple ways to translate it. But the poem essentially starts out, dead end, help us to broaden our destinies. You such a look down upon cave, desert, sharp edge, metropolis. Okay, the rhythm, you can kind of replicate it. There's this sort of aggressivity to his poetry that I was trying to capture. And then further along in the poem, he comes up with this verse. Callejón de Muertita. You can go ahead and look up Muertita. It's not a word, it's a neologism. It's a word, I'm not going to say that he made up, it's an invented word. But you can see two words at once in that word. What are the two words embedded in there? What if they do that, right? In the same word. And there's another poet who plays around with this idea. He's a little bit older than me, Santi Logro, but he embedded this in the poem. And so trying to come up with a way to do justice to that in the translation, trying to get out of the way and let Maria Santiago's voice come through, and working through discussions with many poets, I came up with dead end, live end. Live end isn't a set of words. It makes sense. It's not an invented word, but it's not usually a pair of words that you see sitting together on a page. And that's how I settled on dead end, also as opposed to blind alley, cul-de-sac. It allowed me to do that play of words when I got to the end. And the poem concludes partner, accomplice, little infrarealist brother of ours. He's talking to the callejón, talking to the dead end as a place of absence, but also a place of presence, a place that you would think of as kind of desperate, but a place where he's able to construct these poems, he's able to make something out of essentially nothing. And I'm going to go ahead and stop right there and just say, I've said a few words about the ethics, the responsibility, and hopefully what's also a subtext is the idea of translation as a sort of form of literary criticism. It's a form of reading. I've talked to some of your wonderful instructors, and some of them mentioned the idea of translation as a form of doing deep, careful reading. So if it's something you're interested in, I hope I get the chance to work with you over the next 4 years. I'm going to turn it over to Mago, and we'll have a conversation.
Can you hear me? Okay, great. Well, I also just want to say I'm really excited to be here during LMT because, as Bill said, I used to teach LMT. I taught LMT for the ESL group, for Russian students, taught LMT in Myanmar, taught LMT for BPI in prison. Right now, I'm the assistant dean of the microcolleges, which is part of BPI, the Bar Prison Initiative, and we're doing at the microcolleges in New York City, we're doing LMT right now. So it's a program that's really dear to me. It's great to be here with old friends and colleagues and new students. I want to just maybe start by saying that I translate from Telugu, which is a South Indian language, a non-Indo-European language. Many of you probably have not heard of it, but it's not an obscure language. It's often listed as the 15th most spoken language in the world. It has about between 90 and 100 million speakers worldwide. So that's the language I translate from. I also have done a little bit of Spanish translation, and I have some other languages, but I am going to, sorry, John, just moving through the slides. I'm going to talk, John did a wonderful talk about a little bit of translation practice, and I'm going to zoom out a little bit because I'm a translator, but my work is really, a lot of it is, I think of myself as a translation advocate. I feel like my work is often about translation or thinking about translation as a lens for thinking about other things. And I, for instance, was a jurist last year for the National Book Awards in translation. I think about translation, it's politics, it's ethics. So my talk is a little bit less about my particular translation work, but I do want to do a little bit of show and tell, a couple of slides that do just briefly mention my work, and then I'll launch into it. So this is a book that I co-translated many years ago. It's a translation from Telugu by a writer named Volga, who is a prominent feminist Telugu writer. She actually is a translator also. But that's this book was published in India. This is Kitchen Table Translation, which Bill mentioned. This is a book that I edited a few years ago, and was it's a book that's really about encouraging, like thinking around the connections between translation and migration, and encouraging like BIPOC immigrant translators. This is actually just the current summer and fall issue of Gulf Coast Journal, which is a literary journal. And I edited, curated a small folio for the journal on writing from less translated languages. And the really interesting thing, I'm not going to go into it, but less translated languages are not necessarily small languages. So, for instance, Mandarin, the most spoken language in the world, is a less translated language in the U.S., which is literature. So there's, obviously a politics for that. But this issue had translations from Arabic, Turkish, Kurmanji, which is a variant of Kurdish that's spoken in Rojava. It has Kazakh, Turkmen, Nepali, Telugu, Vietnamese, and Chamorro. And Chamorro is the language spoken in Guam, which of course is the U.S. colony. This book is actually just out. Came out a couple weeks ago. It's called Violent Phenomenon. It's edited by Kavita Bano and Jeremy King. And it's the Violent Phenomenon, that title comes from Frantz Fanon, who will read soon in this year's seminar. But this book is all about decolonizing translation, I have to say. And then this is kind of my emergent kind of, I'm doing some work right now on thinking about ecology and translation. And I just shared this because I gave a talk this summer at another Breadloaf in Vermont. And this was just the description, and I just want to share this because this was my brainstorming. And I wrote this talk in June at the Stevenson Library here at Bard. So I'll share this. But some of this also, I will just actually read this. So the talk that I gave was about exploring ways of moving language and being moved by language that allows for errors, spurs of attention, errancy. Wandering towards ecology and ethics, I asked, how might translation, especially practices that diverge from mainstream literary production, open up thinking past or around the idea of art as monument? Why, given the state of our world, might this matter? So that might not tell you a whole lot just in the description, but I wanted to share it because there's some texts that are related to LMT that were in my thinking, and one was Lucretius. If any of you read a little bit of Lucretius, this word was part of my thinking for this talk, and also Glissant, the errancy part, passive part of my thinking translation. So, but I want to just mention start with the fact that I was last Monday, it's hard to believe, just remembering this, I was in Stockholm. And, I was riding around in the Tunnelbana, which is the metro, and I saw signs like this. And so I saw these signs, in the subway, and I said to my friend, shouldn't that just say utgång? Shouldn't that just say exit? It seemed to me, I don't speak Swedish. I have a little bit of English, but I don't know Swedish. But utgång being translated as way out seemed to me like a literal translation right? Ut from, out, right? And it seemed overly literal. And if you work in translation, like I imagine that some of you, maybe you don't think of yourselves as translators yet, but probably many of you have second languages or partial other languages, or you'll plan to learn other languages. But when you do translation, um, literal translation is often considered bad translation. So you wouldn't call the tunnel the tunnel road, right? You say it's the subway or it's the metro. So the translation of utbang as way out, it's not that significant in the sense that it didn't cause me any great confusion. I knew where to go and what to do. But I knew what it meant. But I have to admit, I kind of like this slightly awkward translation. I think awkward translations can occasionally be really delightful because they stop you. It doesn't allow for language to just be transparent. You just keep going. You just feel like, wait, what's that? So I think there can be occasions when awkwardness can be interesting, but this translation of utbang is way out also delighted me because every time I rode the subway and I saw that sign that said way out, I thought of Kafka's Red Peter. And so the Stockholm subway, is a very pleasant subway system. For me, gained this existential edge. So some of you, I mentioned Red Peter because I imagine some of you might have read for LNT Kafka's Report to an Academy, which is part of this year's LNT anthology. It's a really short text, but for those of you who have not read it, it's a text narrated by Red Peter, who was formerly an ape, who was giving a speech, and Red Peter was captured on the Gold Coast of Africa by humans, like Europeans, and Red Peter, this ape, is imprisoned by these Europeans, captured, and he's shipped off to Europe, where he decides that he's going to become human. So he starts imitating humans, and he, in essence, becomes a human because he says he needed, quote, a way out of his cage. He tells us, I fear that you do not quite understand what I mean by way out. I use this expression in its fullest and most popular sense. I deliberately do not use the word freedom. I do not mean the spacious feeling of freedom on all sides. No, freedom was not what I wanted, only a way out. So there I am in Medborgarplatsen, in the station in the Tunnelbana, wondering what is the word in German that the Muirs translated as way out? Could it be also translated as exit? Was Red Peter looking for an exit, an escape? I don't know if anyone here speaks German, but it'd be really interesting. I don't know the original, but it'd be interesting to see what was the original word in the German. It's like coupling to the, thank you. So, and then the question is, why did they land on this translation? If there's probably very likely this cognate word that, that this might be kind of way out, might feel a little bit more literal, why not say Red Peter was looking for his escape or exit? And one thought I have, not knowing German and not having looked at this text closely recently, is that in fact it is literal for Red Peter. He needs a way out. He's not looking for some abstract notion of freedom, right? But when I read the story, Report to an Academy, Red Peter speaks in English, but of course he's actually speaking German because it's Kafka's story, right? And when in the story, when Red Peter breaks into the human community, he does it by speaking. Kafka says that when Red Peter starts speaking, he suddenly entered the human community, right? And we can assume that he entered it by speaking German. So my question, a question that occurred to me while I was in the Swedish subway station, it exceeds the bounds of the story, but I wanted to know, what are the languages of the Gold Coast? The language of the humans there. Kafka is not particularly interested in this in the story. But then a strange thought came to me, one that Red Peter, with all his bitter irony, would appreciate. Namely, it cannot be the case, right? That to become human is to learn to speak German. You see, like, suddenly I'm in the subway station in Sweden, in Stockholm, and I've worked myself into all sorts of knots thinking about Africa in German. And I tell this anecdote because to me it speaks to something about how I experience translation. So you're just sitting there minding your own business, or you're walking along, and translation comes for you out of the blue. Like I feel like that translation comes after you in a way. It reminds you of your particular body, your particular place, your history, and so on. It's not something that you have to go looking for. Translation is always already with us, out there in the world, and in here in this room. And for me, translation in life and in the world is not disconnected at all from questions of literary translation, all the aesthetic concerns, or the questions of power and colonialism. So here are a couple of assertions I want to make. I have a lot of different publications around translation. These are not particularly provocative, but here are a couple claims I want to make about translation and about why translation can be a useful lens for thinking not just about literary texts, but about our place in the world. First, translation helps us recognize and acknowledge how we are located and dislocated. It reminds us that language is not just an abstraction, but emerges out of particular places, under particular pressures and particular times. I mean, this goes to what John was saying about Spanish from Spain versus Spanish from Mexico, right? We are located and dislocated in languages. The words way out reminded me that I was not in an English language context, even though those words were English. The words had traveled. Another second, I want to say that translation offers a productive site to think about difference. Since there's no way around questions of otherness and difference in the practice of literary translation. And one thing I really love about translators as writers, and let's just also be clear, translators are creative writers. So translation is an art. I think sometimes people think of it as just like a function, a little bit later, but if we're thinking about translators as writers, one thing that I love about translators is that they're always also interested in something other than themselves, right? But the question of how we do it, translation, and how we treat difference matters. I really do believe that translation is not an automatic good. It really matters, as John mentioned, ethics, how you go about it. And third, translation emerges from gaps, blanks, voids, and silences. And this, I think, is part of its ethics. Translators often talk about the impossibility of translation. Like you can't get an exact translation of a word or phrase or idea. But I also think that this is an invitation to face the challenge and the difficulty, to make good and to make do. And this is where I think of Glissant's On Opacity, which some of you might also have read. I think translation shows us not only what we can do, but how to live with what we can't do. I'm going to end this talk by actually just reading an excerpt from the book the introduction to the book that I edited, which is a kitchen table translation book. And I think it's connected to these couple of assertions that I just made, that I went back to. So here it is. A few years ago, the translator Bill Martin, and I should say Bill Martin is someone who I met here who was teaching LT as well. So Bill Martin invited me to participate in the Bridge series, which produced regular events in New York City focused on literary translation. I was really excited about the invitation, but that invitation brought to surface a lot of my own anxieties about translation, and I said no, actually, at first. And even though I had already published translations, I didn't feel comfortable. I live in New York City, I did not feel comfortable going and doing an event and talking about translation with a bunch of literary people in New York. At some point, I began to understand that my discomfort with translation was connected to the trauma of immigration. Something went quiet in me when I was brought to the US from India as a child. Although I assimilated and lost my accent, a vital part of me got stopped at the border. My inner life remained untranslated. its contours beyond what the receiving culture wanted to or could comprehend. As an immigrant child, I felt an aura of illegitimacy about my claim to be an American. At times, I lived with radical insecurity. As an adult, when I began to translate in Telugu, which is my first language, and which I learned to read in college, but illiterate in college, I experienced a repetition of the loss I felt as a child. I not only worried about my distance from the language, but also wondered how the text I was translating would be received in the US, whether and on what terms it would belong. Translators often speak about the impossibility of their work, the untranslatability of particular words or text from one language to the other. What does it mean to be a translated self, I wondered. What does it mean to live with this untranslatability, the silence between languages within you? So this book, I'm still reading the introduction, but Kitchen Table Translation extends from this personal experience to a greater curiosity about how immigrants, children of immigrants, or people who identify as part of a diaspora may bring a particular set of concerns to the task of translation, distinct from the mainstream of literary translation in the US. When the movement of text, translation, is linked with the movement of bodies, migration, issues of language and culture necessarily collide with questions about politics, history, race, and imperialism, the very context of migration and diaspora. I wanted to hear from writers and translators who could speak about personal, cultural, and political dimensions of translation in relation to the technical and aesthetic aspects of the work. When it's even acknowledged, much of literary translation in the US, especially of prose, is appraised in terms of fluency. The idea that you can't even tell if it's a translation. So it reads just like perfect English. A fluent translation avoids literalism and awkwardness. The wrinkles that would remind us that the translation are ironed out. There's an emphasis on a translator's mastery of language and an artfully inconspicuous technique. Whereas in most parts of the world, particularly in post-colonial contexts, translation is recognized as inherently political. Discussions of literary translation in the US emphasize formal concerns with a light attention to cultural variance. So how might we think about these values? What are the questions we might ask? There are the questions of what gets translated and why, and then how. If fidelity and submission to the original are marks of a good translation, how might errant, disobedient translation serve us? If fluency and domesticization are prized, what might a translation that reminds us of the text's foreignness provide? Translation can function politically in a range of ways. I'm going to quote Venuti again, who John mentioned. Lawrence Venuti argues that the Anglo-American emphasis on fluency enacts an ethnocentric violence. In this sense, fluency can be compatible with multicultural and cosmopolitan celebrations of translation that nevertheless do not seek to interrogate the dominant culture and its existing norms, and which is only superficially interested in difference. Right? So we all know that there's there can be forms of diversity and multiculturalism that actually aren't that deep, right? That don't actually interrogate difference. Translation can also perform subtle acts of critical resistance by introducing text into the English language that speak from marginalized voices and values, or through modes of translation that do not seek to erase the otherness of the original text. I'm interested in making space for the fact that translation can be an intimate act, and many of us use our translation skills in non-professional as well as professional capacity. Some of us, when we translate, call on our family other than colleagues to help us with challenging passages or words. Some second-generation diasporic and indigenous writers who speak or partly speak an ancestral language at home might find the discourse of mastery fraught, especially when access to a language has been lost through historical violence and dislocation. And some of us experience translation all the time in our bodies, names, homes, movements, and daily lives, even if we are not translating from one text to another. I think, though, that the personal experiences of otherness can potentially lend creative and critical charge to the work of translation. For me, with all of the predicaments that translation holds, it's an act of hospitality. Hospitality not conceived as charity, but a hospitality that recognizes both the dignity and difference of the other. In this model, translation is not about assimilation of the other language or the other body. The impossibility of any particular translation is not a difficulty to be overcome, just as the difference of an immigrant, a refugee, or anyone deemed other is not a difference to be overcome, or greeted with care. Here, I think of Glissant's opacity, that some of you may have read. Translation, I think, can be a practice of hospitality that acknowledges that the host, too, i.e. the receiving language, too, will have to be changed by the encounter. We may unravel and have to remake ourselves with others. This is not a simple task that can be celebrated in the usual good ways, but I think it's beautiful and worthwhile. And in the words of Yumna Shvala, who's a Lebanese poet and artist who is in this anthology that I edited, she writes, "First we had to learn each other's languages. This was the longest, most loving trial. Then we ended our own."
So what we agreed upon is we got questions for each other. We'll be brief with our questions for one another, but that was amazing. Thank you. Can I start with my question? You, in an interview, said a line. Every so often when I'm teaching, it was a really good line. I joke with my students that line would make a good tattoo. This line is one of those. In an interview, you responded to, or you were discussing the issue of translation, and you kind of led into translation with a question saying, "How do you want to be wrong?" And I thought that was such a beautiful way to put it. Could you say a little bit more about that sentiment?
Thanks. So I just want to acknowledge that when I was reading or talking just now, it was not so interactive, and I was like blocked by the microphone, and so I'm actually glad to be able to see everyone better now. And I see also in the audience I saw Raj. So I just want to also give a shout out to Raj because that interview was conducted by Raj. And so we had a conversation about translation. And so I really, again, I think I just encourage people all the time to try translation. Even, especially those of you who feel like I don't have enough, like I'm not good enough, and that happens a lot of times for people who, again, like maybe you speak Spanish with your grandma, but you don't feel like, oh, I haven't studied Spanish in university, and I don't, I'm not good enough. And so there's that kind of like being wrong, which is like kind of the conventional way of like, a lot of times translators can be really hard on each other. But to me, there's something much more exciting, which is like how, like, in translation, you're always going to be wrong because you always lose something. You lose the sound, you lose some of the context. So it's a question of like, what do you want to prioritize and what do you want to give up? And I almost feel like there's something like delightful and like pleasurable about saying, okay, this is going to be wrong. It's not going to be perfect. It's like you give up the idea of the perfect. You give up the idea of a world that doesn't have difference, right? Where everything can become whole. But then what? You have this possibility of saying, okay, I'm going to have to give up something, but I'm going to go all the way with this other thing, right? I'm going to, just to say, like, this amazing talk I recently heard, this Russian poet, Polina Vorskova, who was translated, has a book of poetry out, Air Raid, translated by the Belarusian poet Belgian Mort. And Belgian Mort just decided that she was going to translate, in each of the poems, she picked up a stanza and she just said, I'm going to listen to the sound and I'm going to translate the sound into English, right? And so you could say that that translation is wrong in a lot of ways because you miss a lot of, content in that poem. But, it's going all the way with, the sonic element, right? So that sense of like, I think all of this is just to say that translation is creative work. It's a creative practice. So I think just to encourage people not to feel like, oh, I have, like, there's a one way to get it right. So if you start off with the premise of like, it's gonna be wrong in some ways. I mean, I'm saying that honestly in a facetious, playful way. Then you get to play and say, but how can I make it amazingly wrong? I'm just gonna ask. Right, so on that note, I wanted to ask you a question because you started off talking about Neruda, and then there's like a progression towards like very different kinds of poets that you've translated who maybe were anti-institutional, who don't get the kind of attention that Neruda got. We know that Neruda, like everyone's heard of Neruda, right? And he's been translated by many translators into many languages. Films have been made about him. And I was wondering if you talk a little bit about like why some poets, why there's so much attention to someone like Neruda and so many multiple translations of Neruda, and why there are other, like your experience of like the kinds of poet, like why other writers don't get that attention, and what it's like to work, to have to bring, basically as a translator, you introduce people into the English language, right? So talk a little bit about that context.
Sure, thanks for that question. I think I mentioned the idea of Neruda sort of performing originality for certain readers. And, to begin with, there's kind of multiple Nerudas. The one I was quoting is the famous love poem, Poem 20. There's a Chilean historian named Bernardo Sudargasso who did a study of books that were published. There's a dictatorship in Chile from 1973 to 1990. And there's a historian who looked at what actual books were published over the course of those 17 years. And Neruda was by and large censored. His books weren't published or published or circulated in Chile, but the love poems were. So the 20 love poems and the Song of Despair were just fine. They didn't have political content. So I think Neruda had so many different facets. So many of his books are so radically different. If you look at Canto General from 1950, it's his attempt to write a history of the American continent in verse. And it's very, very different from, say, his love poetry or some of his more experimental poetry in Residencia and in other books in the 30s and 40s. So I think there's multiple Nerudas, and certain poets kind of latch on to their Neruda. And in the 1960s, you would see, for example, Neruda came into English by means of the 60s magazine. In a lot of ways, Robert Bly, who's a poet you might have heard of, quite a presence, quite an individual. I find him a little problematic in a few ways. And as a translator, what he would do is he'd get somebody who could speak the language to do a gloss, and then he'd do a poetry version of that gloss and dress it up in certain ways. And this is all to say, as you mentioned, there's many people who work on Neruda as an object of their translation, and they kind of come to him with a certain set of expectations, and I also think impose those expectations on the text. And poetry, literature broadly doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in certain institutions that are going to promote and value certain kinds of writing above others. And so, just very briefly to touch back the poets that I was talking about, the Imperas, and thinking again about the youthfulness and their anti-institutional stance, they weren't very keen on the idea of publishing in the context of the 1970s Mexico for a handful of reasons. They couldn't separate the institutional support for publishing from the state apparatus, and so they're very rebellious and resistant to that. And they would show up at stuff like this. If there was a fancy poet on the stage, and they would take out tomatoes and chop them. They would actually, no, please, nobody get any ideas. But we're not fancy, so we don't have anything to worry about. But they kind of excluded themselves from certain kind of institutional participation for a long, long time. And it wasn't until Bolaño's novel came out that they were kind of reevaluated sort of an institutional lens. Does that answer your question? Yeah. Cool. Well, I think you want to do a couple more questions before we open it up, or should we open it up?
Maybe, if people have questions, I think we're happy to take them. And,
Yeah.
And if you don't, we'll keep going and then you can put up your questions.
Oh, it's such a great question. If everybody couldn't hear the question, I was referring to the Iliad in particular, but with certain texts, certain translations value more the sonics, the musicality of the text. Other translations value the literal sense. Do you want to take that as the last one speaking? Do you want to take the first pass? I have thoughts, but. Well, sure. My first thought is it really depends on the context and the readership it's for. So you're all getting a brand new iteration of first year seminar, starting in about a week. Some of us, I see Professor Bilal nodding back there, some of us taught a different iteration of FISEM for a few years, in which the Odyssey was sort of the capstone piece that we ended with. And I had curiosity about why this edition of the Odyssey as opposed to another edition. It wasn't one I read as an undergraduate, it was a different one. And the response from Daniel Mendelsohn, who was one of the directors of FISEM at the time, was because it captured the sense of humor better. And he thought at the end of the slog of reading all these books over the course of the year, something that'll make you chuckle once or twice is not to be looked down upon. So it would really depend on if it's for reading out loud, if it's for reading individually. I mean, there's editions, you can see editions of the Iliad and the Odyssey with prose, right? That are rendered entirely in prose. So I think myself, just thinking about when I'm translating contemporary poetry, I really have the musicality in mind in some way, shape, or form. I want to get that across because I think it's important. I think just a gloss usually won't do much justice to the original text, and especially in the sense that it'll probably bore the reader. I mean, if it's just the most literal gloss that has no musicality or no notion of what the rhythm the poet is going for, what other poets the poet is dialoguing with, maybe in their head as they're writing. If you miss that, I think you miss something potentially important.
I think a really fun thing to do is read multiple translations together. I did this a while ago. A couple of friends and I. It actually started. A friend had a question. Like, oh, I've never read Dante. Which version should I read? And of course, this is why I actually never read Dante, because I was like, there's like 25 translations. How do I know which is the best? Where do I start, right? And so we did this thing where we read, I think, 4 or 5 versions together. Like, it's very slow, but we read, stanza one, stanza the other. And I think, to me, it's like, I think part of what happens with something like the Iliad, right, is that there's already so many. So often what happens is someone sees something that's missing, right? Like, okay, this translation, like, part of it is like, if you're a poet, there's also this thing that happens where, like, there's this is like a false divide, I think, but there is a kind of general feeling of like there's poets who translate and there's scholars who translate. So the scholarly translation is going to have more footnotes and it's going to be like really need you to know the meaning of all of this. And the poet, listening, paying attention to rhythm and sound. That's a reductive way of thinking about it, but those are kind of like 2 ends of it. But I think that there's a sense of like, okay, I think this version didn't capture this part of the text, and I think I'm the person to do it, right? And the example that I can think of is Emily Wilson. She did the Odyssey. So Emily Wilson, a couple of years ago, translated the Odyssey, and she was the first woman translator, I believe, of the Odyssey. And it's interesting to say, like, what was missing. I mean, she has a lot of other ways of thinking about translation in terms of, she's very particular about meter. And so she's very sonically attuned, rhythmically attuned. But I think also there were some choices she made that kind of, you could say it's like a feminist translation of the Odyssey, right? And if you think about what's been missing, thinking about like how various translators have characterized Nausicaa or the sirens, right? Things like that. So I think it's, again, I think to me what's really interesting is actually translation really brings out this value of multiplicity. And so even the way that John said, there's multiple narrators, every text is multiple. And I think this is a really cool thing. It's like translation undoes actually the idea of the original and the one, and suddenly it's like a whole bunch of things are in circulation.
Can I follow up with a question for you, actually, about do you run into issues with the differences between Telugu and English in terms of musicality? Even though it's prose you're working with, it, how do you deal with that? How does that, are there particularities you can speak to in terms of that? I'm very curious.
Yeah, so I work with prose. I've done a little bit of poetry, which is really, really hard. But so it's not as intense question, but there is a different music. I think actually the interesting thing, this was not a real work of translation, but I did a workshop where this really fun thing. I was in India leading a workshop where we took a Chinese poem and I asked the students to translate it into Telugu. And it was a really fun exercise because my language, Telugu, has no monosyllables. Even the word I is 2 syllables. And the Chinese poem, is all these monosyllables, right? And so, like my language is like, let's say the original poem was like da 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 da, and my language was like da 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 da, right? And so I'm like, okay, this is really fun to think about what is this poem doing phonically, and given the impossibility of rendering it into, the rhythms of this other language, how am I going to capture some element of the spirit of it, right? In terms of prose, I think it's just that syntactically, I mean, any of you who, especially if you work in a let's say, European language, word order can be really different. I know that when I've taught students who do speak Russian or Chinese, use of articles is really different. So that just is like, those are basic things in terms of trying not to like stumble over yourself and like to be too literal. But I think that, Telugu is a South Indian language that in the 19th century, Orientalist scholar called the language the Italian of the East, which is a weird thing, actually, because, it's so weird. But I think it is that kind of the long vowels, like again, you think about Italian not being so monosyllabic. But I think that there's something, so there is a kind of rhythm to sentences, I think, that is different than the more, especially the Germanic, Anglo-Saxon, sounds of English. But this is also probably why I don't work in poetry. It's hard. Other questions?
I would be happy to maybe talk a bit more about this and how it relates to the notion of philosophy, like the songs of philosophy.
The question, maybe make sure I got it right. You wanted to ask about translatability and how it relates to opacity.
Yeah.
So I want to say a couple things. I have been fortunate to be in conversation with some really wonderful colleagues who, Mona Kareem is a translator from Arabic who gave a talk. It was not for Bard, but she also recorded it at the Stevenson Library. I feel like the Stevenson Library is like a hotbed for translation work. And she gave a talk it's called Against Translation and Against Visibility. And my colleague Dima Ayub, who is a professor in Vermont of Arabic and Middle Eastern Studies, has been talking about maybe don't do translation. Like maybe there's reasons sometimes to be against translation. And I think that's about the politics of how translation circulates sometimes and its use. It can be like, especially in Arabic, Arabic, for instance, is a language that has been used very politically is after 9/11 to like, let's find out about the heart of the Arab mind, right? Like or the heart of the Arab or the Arab mind, and let's get into it. Like, so it's this, it can be problematic on that level. And I think my own thinking around opacity is, I think there are a couple of things, and I think there's something that I'm working through around respecting silence in text and respecting those, like, so one thing that happens, translation is an act of interpretation, right? Like if I'm reading a poem and I'm going to translate it, I mean, some of the examples we gave are more kind of like, that one example felt like a more transparent poem, the first poem that you showed us. But poetry itself is full of opacity, right? Like that there are silences, and I think this notion of like our job is to literally like make something very transparent for the reader in English. It can be a kind of violence of not respecting the difference of the other culture, of the other language, of the other text. So part of it is interpretive, like letting something not come through. And this is again, so in translation studies, I'm sorry, this is very basic, but I think it's not maybe known that in translation studies, there's two extremes. One is like domesticization, where you make the foreign text sound really like it could just have been written in English. You assimilate everything. And then there's foreignization, where you kind of leave those marks of difference in the text. Like maybe there are words that you don't translate. Or, there's some feeling of like you can tell that it's, the text is not just written by like, a person in Poughkeepsie, right? And so I think to me the question around opacity is to say, can you actually live with difference? Can you live with a text that you can't dominate because you completely understand it? So that's kind of my thinking.
Thank you for that answer. Thank you for that question. Just to do another plug for things related to the BARD. There is an initiative for translation and translatability on campus. There's an annual conference. The Sui Generis Journal is usually been presented at that conference, but there's a faculty group that works on this on a regular basis and meets up with the students at least once or twice a year, so you can participate in that. One of the slides that I skipped past for the sake of time, I was going to talk briefly about George Steiner and After Babel, and just kind of an often cited quote that I'll paraphrase, but if you think about it, the act of reading is an act of translation, and what is a bunch of black squiggles on a page comes into your head and creates a different meaning from what may or may not originally be on the page. Something shifted there already, something may or may not have been lost. I prefer to think of in terms of something getting produced, but even trying to use the verb to dominate in this, not usually, but in this context, the idea of dominating language. The power dynamics that come into notions of translatability, I think are really important to take into account. And positionality is a word I've used in my workshop a few times, thinking about where you're coming from. The scholar that I find has the most clarity about this is actually a linguist, and she's a Miche linguist from the state of Oaxaca, Mexico. Her name is Yasnaya Nina, and she has a book in Spanish called Nosotros sin Estado, a we without a state, or us without a state, depending on how you care to translate it. And she is very resistant in her own work. She speaks Miche as her native language, and she works in Spanish. She gave a lecture here in English last semester, and she's really protective about notions of what can and cannot be translated out of her own culture, and will flat out refuse. I have the utmost respect for her. I won't name names, but she was offered. I'll back up a second. So if you're in Mexico and you see somebody like Gael Garcia Bernal, like a hugely famous actor, or Diego Luna, if you've seen that Star Wars movie, he's in it. In fact, there's a couple of very famous Mexican actors that she kind of rubs elbows with. She has high visibility in Mexico. She's been on some programs where she's interviewed by these folks. A big multinational corporation offered her a very good contract to publish some of her work, and she flat out said no, because because it's not translatable culturally, and she refused to have it co-opted in a certain way. And she uses the context of Mexico. If we were to take a trip back to early 19th century Mexico, about 60% of the population spoke a language other than Spanish, an indigenous language. If we go down to Mexico now, it's approximately 6%, which is a very large number. Nahuatl is still spoken by 1,500,000 people approximately. But her resistance is rooted in the disappearance of her culture and the idea of not giving something up, not letting something go. I have nothing but the utmost respect for her thinking of translatability in terms of practicality and how it can be a form of resistance to say, you know what, you don't get this. You can't get your hands on this. You can't necessarily dominate this. I think it's an important question to ask yourself. The flip side is, when is giving up and going into silence less than ideal? And what is that sort of line that you have to figure out and negotiate for yourself about what do you bring across into a language like English, what do you potentially lose? If we go back to the Steiner quote, that even as we read, we lose, or perhaps we gain something, we're modifying the text simply by looking at it. The observer's paradox made real in point of translation. So I love the question. There's a lot of thinking about it that goes on on this campus, and I hope you can participate in that thinking as well. It's the afternoon rostering fatigue. The last rostering. Could you, the notion of hospitality, this kind of does get us back to this question of translatability in translation. I'm just wondering, that in your piece, in kitchen table translations, how did you get to the notion of hospitality? Could you unpack that notion a little bit more if you'd be willing to? It's really interesting. As you mentioned, the Iliad, this kind of idea of hospitality, xenia, being kind to others. Interesting to hear more about that.
Unfortunately, the answer comes from outside of translation. I have another part of my life where I was doing performance art, and I was doing a lot of performance art around hospitality, but all of it comes from thinking about the strange, right? In Homer, it's like there's a stranger, and how do you treat the stranger, right? And I think it's not a big leap to say this is also coming from my own experience of being an immigrant and thinking about what does it mean to belong, and on what terms do we belong, right? There's this idea of hospitality. Like, one of the thoughts I had, there's a moment where I was thinking about the way that we talk about immigration in the US, is somehow we bestow grace on other people by allowing them to come into this country, and that we, I don't know, there's a rhetoric around it that's like, it's this magnanimous, noble thing to do to let people in. And I was like, but what if it's like, what if you flip that and say, it's the immigrants who are coming here, like, they're doing this immense service, and I'm not to you, people who are here. I don't mean in that the labor that they provide, because that's often the terms in which we talk about that. Like, oh, they do the jobs that no one wants to do. That's not what I mean. And I also don't mean they do the service of like, now we eat tacos and eat sushi, because I don't mean that either. I mean that they actually, they are also the holder, they are transforming the local culture, right? It's like, there's this notion that immigrants, we speak about immigration in these like very narrow terms, but actually they are reproducing whatever is U.S. culture, right? And inflecting it with, different kind of, elements. And I guess I wanted to rethink this idea that there's this magnanimous host that receive, and so that to translate a text, like the way that we think about immigration, to translate a text is to do something incredibly noble and bring something across. But I think I was interested in hospitality because I think it actually also talks about, it's a term that includes risk, right? That you have to risk something, you have to risk some vulnerability um, you know, that meeting the other requires some vulnerability. And I actually think about that in terms of translation, that, you know, it's not just about how do I make this text as appealing as possible to the already known audience of English readers, but how can I, because translation energizes the local culture and language, and it changes, like, so to translate a text into English means that you are in some ways changing English, potentially, right? But you can, I think that it can be a really interesting, subversive, radical thing. It isn't always, like, just, you know, I said in my talk, like, translation can function in a range of ways. Translation has been a tool of imperialism. I speak, you know, I didn't ask this question, but, you know, I know, like, there's many people here who speak different languages other than English, but I imagine there are also people here who speak multiple Englishes. Like, maybe there's a language that you speak at home that's in English, and a different English that you speak in the classroom. I know I speak at least 2 Englishes. In India, I don't talk like this, but I speak English. And so there's kind of thinking about hospitality for me is a way of thinking about how we meet difference, how we meet each other. And I guess it's like I'm interested in destabilizing the notion of, like, one language is begging for entrance, you know, into the home of another. But to think about how do we also allow ourselves to be changed when you're translating something into your own. Any other, yeah, there's a question.
So, as someone who's kind of learning a language, I've found that kind of internally, I impose this kind of English-centric, like, I don't know if this is the right word, but it's almost kind of fetishistic, where it's like this extremely stereotyped version of that language that I agree to have myself. How do you kind of avoid that internal, imperialism is the right word, but that's a general idea of what I mean.
There's a scholar that occurs to me, Willis Barnstone, who has a book, I'm blanking. If you look up Barnstone translation, I'm up here. And this is a book maybe 40, 50 years old plus. And he actually advocates for doing that, curiously enough. And what his goal is kind of to leave the roots, to borrow phrase from Charles Olson, kind of leave the roots of the language out of which one is translating hanging off in a certain way. I can see also the problematic nature of that. But I think, you know, if you want advice, Jackson, if you want a particular concrete thing, I would, you know, I hope I didn't overstate the case when I was talking about myself sitting there writing letters, worrying about am I doing the right thing, doing the wrong thing. Of course, ethics and responsibility are a part of translation. Of course, you should be thinking about your own relationship to language and language's relationship to its context, but you should also experiment. You should also make a mess. If the first translation came out looking glorious and gorgeous, you know, you might be a genius, you might have luckily fallen into something, but I don't have that experience ever as a translator. It always comes out as a mess. I always have to tweak it, work on it. You know, if I had hair, I'd rip it out. You know, I mean, I'm going in there, we're doing the best I can with the text, and it's a struggle, and it's dirty. You know, you're getting linguistically grubby. You're kind of sweaty at the end of the tension. You're working so hard. So, you know, own that. Use that. Don't feel that if it comes out, and I'm going to back up a second. Think about so many times when I'm teaching literature, particularly from Latin America, there's like a hesitancy from students. They don't want to get something wrong and say something that's going to upset somebody or is going to be offensive or what have you. And, you know, the texts are strong. They can hold up to that. You know, they're not moved in violence. So, you know, in treating texts with dignity and respect, you can also bear in mind that the context out of which they come and the texts themselves can take something of what you're going to dish out. And, you know, there is a difference also between sitting there and translating for yourself or translating for your friends and publishing. You know, that is a slightly different beast in a certain regard. But I come back to the idea of translation as a form of literary criticism. And even what you're describing is kind of a form of trying to establish a relationship with a language and a culture that's different and thinking your way through it. And the metaphor that I often use when talking about literary criticism with students who sometimes get a little uptight and worried about doing an act of literary criticism, writing an essay, I think of literary criticism sort of as a conversation. And so if you're going into Klein and there's a conversation going on, you don't just jump on the table and take over the conversation. You figure out what's happening and you ease your way into the conversation. So if you just think about that stage of it as easing your way into the conversation, figuring out what are the terms of the conversation, what's the flow of it, what's the tone of it. I don't think it's anything to feel bad about or think it's bad necessarily. It's a step along the way. It's my first reaction.
I guess I'll just add, I specifically maybe was talking more about ethics and politics, and then you can all get very rigid, right? Like, oh shit, I'm not supposed to, am I allowed to do that? Like, I was visiting a class, and a student who was Palestinian said, I want to translate this Black writer, but I don't know if I'm allowed. I'm not Black, right? Like there are all sorts of like big political ethical questions. And first of all, it's like, you're Palestinian. there's just go for it. But also, I actually don't think, you can get tied up with these questions, these political questions of I'm actually less interested in who has the right to do something. I don't think that's actually what ethics is who has the right to do something. In part because I think of rights as a kind of Western Enlightenment discourse. The question really is, what is your responsibility and commitment, right? And even that can feel heavy. And so I just going back to the playful part and maybe say maybe ending on the note of then why translate? It's actually because it's so much fun. And maybe that hasn't come through so much, but in what I've said, but if you're a writer, if you care about language, you learn so much about language by doing it, right? And again, if you're going to publish something, what you'll do is just show it to your friends and you show it to your mentor, and you'll have those conversations to see, to kind of gauge what you're doing. But translation, it just brings language alive, and I think anyone who's a creative writer, it makes you a better creative writer because you start to pay attention to language in a really different way, and you start to know even the English language in a more intense way. And so I think it's actually when I say I advocate for translation, it's certainly if you're interested in doing it professionally, great. There's all sorts of ways to kind of enter that path. But I also think it's just something fun to do and to play with and read translations and read multiple read the Iliad in different versions, right? And get a feeling for how I think it's just in the same way that it can feel kind of I have to get it right. I think translation is also very forgiving. It tells you that there is no right answer and that there are many languages. So maybe that's a good place for us to end.
We'll be here for a couple of minutes before we Thank you.
I like it. Yeah, me too. What is this for? I have no idea. It's so weird. They're recording.
Oh.
He saw me. Oh, it's YouTube.
I think this is just live.
Cool. Well, hey Caleb.
I tried to give it to the anthology, but I don't have anything about the other man's.
So there is an advising session. I think it's there might be an advising session, but I wrote something. If you're interested, I would just take a look at it. Say that might be of your interest. Of course, take the test and stuff, I see whatever day. Just take a peek.
I transferred from yeah. But yeah, so he gave me like feeds consider loss.
He's one of, that one is John. The rare area is not shielding. The only reason I thought it was growing up, the had paragraph custom. And back in the day, the Ginsburg would show up, or so. And 1 year they had traffic, lost it. Just like the flexibility. And so, I had to control the needs. So we drove it. Black Sparrow publishes. Yeah, we did that. We did not use it, but the example is very cool. It's much easier to just get the text in here. What do you think?
Yeah.
Hell yeah.
But it is, you want to see Spanish also, I would say. It's a month, 30 days. Every student, when I say that, I should. We have, so the Spanish studies.
Yeah, it's basically it's a one-man box, so it just has a very, very massive, very graphs. They were here's the process of fraud. And they also write a lot of songs about small animals. Which is really great. Yeah, I've seen lots of those.
It's the summer road that is required as left.
It was an admirable effort, though. Like, I'm gonna give you that.
This year, I saw a photo of,
In English, it's Delta.
this changed my whole consumption because of just like, I was like, because of my cookies, get dry, it was hot.
Yeah.
Oh, it changed my mood.
There are similar water, air, fire. Vast sky in there, sea, that's what I see.
First time we can talk about stuff.
But I was thinking, you know, this initiative called River Recreation. So, you probably have to talk about. We put this together in the last couple of years, where we tries to, well, against the prevailing wisdom, publishing and criticism by highlighting more that actually has sort of really the inside story to including and he's talking about the close water against Jameson's very convincingly demonstrate how close water is always some kind of continuation, not like
Yeah, Chris. It's all. I want to copy.
Yeah,
So,
I'll text you.
are you gonna be?
gonna hang out with us?
I'm gonna do it.
Oh, good.
Is it too much?
So,
Oh, it's tomorrow, it's gonna start like 8.
yeah, I mean, officially, it's
So-
down at 7:30, but we usually have 3 minutes for.
Yeah.
Okay, that's
Yeah,
good.
so,
Cool.
Why don't you just, look to trade right after the.
Yes, it's gonna go straight.
I know why.
Well, it's good to be honest, it's a lot of folks. I have a lot of questions. Yeah.
yeah, Mondays are our longest day.
Yeah, it's usually, I mean, I had folks up in the chat. The kid with green hair is obviously conceptual.
Like we've had students running.
It's always something in the robots. It's still that thing, that's like, wow. Makes sense. But yeah, it was probably. And it was just people see it very.
Yeah, I saw him.
Yeah.
That's great.
That's
Alright, yeah.
I guess we should talk more, yeah, I mean, you know, I think also does stuff with, Indian translation. Translations, from regional languages of India as well as, theatrical traditions. And, you know, his calls of activity are Indian, so. But now he's at Bristol University. I mean, he's literally faculty of the house. And it's a center for Korea, critical Korea.
Yeah. I just feel like they're doing some really interesting things there.
Yeah, yeah. So anyway, I should put you in touch with
Can I ask you?
Yeah.
Your languages are Italian and Greek.
Italian, Greek, Latin, Hebrew, Mandarin, Japanese,
You're not a composer.
Not even. My native tongue is English. And traces of it. But modern Chinese has written is always, almost always, can't be the that is always people say, Chinese have all these languages, but writing is all the same. No, it's all the same because it's all Mandarin. Okay? You would be like, say, oh yeah, you know, writing. But no,
You can translate it into, right?
Yeah, yeah. And the thing that seem like, yeah, so there are many words that are not yet understood in the Reich. That's actually something that we're working on and off, is to translate the sound into characters. But there will be the characters that are used in Mandarin, they're different words. Some of them are easier to understand. Many of them are so, for example, they look for a walk. So, word walk is from the Cantonese, which is cognitive wall in Chinese, that would be wit. It's just a different word. It's not the normal word that we use for walk. One we use is eat. But if you you translate that back to language, is used only for total period funerary vessels, found 3,000 years ago. Okay? So this word that has been used for activity for thousands of years, and has done our research, is really preserved in everyday use, but people don't even think about it, even though the character doesn't exist. But then there are others that are hard to find, and the hardest thing is all the illusions. Now these are, as far as I know, most illusions of speaking Chinese, where you have, two, sometimes three, maybe sometimes even four syllables, four words, monosyllables, rush together. And you gotta know how they crashed it right before they eventually talk. You unpack that to parse it out into writing. You see? Then if you're writing, vernacular, then there's all these. But these are very interesting questions of literary translation.
I mean, I think there's something, also just like, separate from that was really, interesting text I read about how, for instance, Buddhism was translated probably to the Chinese. So, I think questions around, like, other, like,
Actually, I think a lot of the Chinese was English to Sanskrit. There were other translations.
but I think that there are, I feel like really, because like so much of my work, my universe is like going,